look on the bright side of life. Life is beautiful. You're just focusing on the negative. These are phrases that antinatalists and philosophical pessimists alike hear pretty often. In this video, I want to discuss the underbelly of the human condition and challenge the notion that life is as good as many believe it is. And I want to explore how this relates to antinatalism. Now, before we dive in, I want to note that I'm mainly going to be focusing on humans, but many of the points I'm making will be applicable to other sentient beings as well, like non-human animals. So, without further ado, let's get started. Let's start by examining several asymmetries between the good things and the bad things in life. Asymmetries in the character of goods and bads have been highlighted by philosophers before, like Arthur Schopenhauer in The World as Will and Representation, Volume 2. We feel pain but not painlessness, care but not freedom from care, fear but not safety and security. We feel the desire as we feel hunger and thirst, but as soon as it has been satisfied, it is like the mouthful of food which has been taken and which ceases to exist for our feelings the moment it is swallowed. We painfully feel the loss of pleasures and enjoyments as soon as they fail to appear. But when pains cease, even after being present for a long time, their absence is not directly felt, but at most they are thought of intentionally by means of reflection. The hours pass, the more quickly, the more pleasantly they are spent, and the more slowly, the more painfully they are spent. Since pain, not pleasure, is the positive thing, whose presence makes itself felt. In just the same way, we become conscious of time when we are bored, not when we're amused. But to move to a more contemporary philosopher, David Benatar is perhaps best known for his axiological asymmetry or his value-based asymmetry. But he's also provided what I think is clearer commentary on these empirical asymmetries between the goods and bads in life. In his Eon article, Kids Just Say No, he describes a fundamental asymmetry between the goods and bads in life. The worst pains, for instance, are worse than the best pleasures are good. If you doubt this, ask yourself, honestly, whether you would accept a minute of the worst tortures in exchange for a minute or two of the greatest delights. This axiological asymmetry, which is different from the axiological asymmetry that he's more well known for, suggests that we tend to disvalue the worst pains more than we value the best pleasures. And to accompany this axiological asymmetry, there are a range of empirical ones. Benatar lays out some of these in his paper, Life is Not Good. Whereas the most intense pleasures, such as sexual or gustatory ones, are short-lived, the worst pains have the capacity to be much more enduring. Indeed, pleasures in general tend to be shorter lived than pains. Chronic pain is common, whereas there's no such thing as chronic pleasure. And it's worth noting that even in cases where someone might think chronic pleasure is possible, like persistent genital arousal disorder, which is a rare disorder where someone can have 100 orgasms a day, such experiences can actually significantly negatively affect our lives, both physically and mentally, ultimately reducing one's quality of life when they are sourced in something that we often associate with being very pleasurable. So what might initially seem like a form of chronic pleasure can actually be deleterious to our lives. And even if we could identify genuine instances of chronic pleasure, they're going to be far rarer than the equivalent conditions involving pain, which are all too common. Moving on, again in Life is Not Good, Benatar presents another telling asymmetry. Consider how an injury can be incurred in a split second and the effects felt for life. While it is true that we can also avoid an injury in an instant, we do not gain benefits that are comparable in their magnitude and longevity in a mere moment. A lifetime of learning can be obliterated by a cerebral stroke, but there are no comparable events in which one acquires as much knowledge and understanding so speedily and easily. One can lose a limb or an eye in a few seconds, whereas gaining mobility or sight, where it is possible at all, never occurs so rapidly, effortlessly, or completely. A life in which benefit came quickly and effortlessly, and harm came only slowly and with effort, would be a fantastically better life. And finally, I want to address an asymmetry related to desires, which will then neatly take us on to the next section. So later in the paper, Benatar says this: consider the fulfillment of our desires or the satisfaction of our preferences. There are various reasons why there is more unfulfillment than fulfillment. First, many desires are never fulfilled. Second, even when desires are fulfilled, this usually occurs only after the exercise of effort. This means that there is a period of time in which the desire is not yet fulfilled. fulfilled. Finally, when desires are eventually fulfilled, the satisfaction is typically only transitory. Satisfied desires give way to new desires. For example, one is hungry, eats to satiety, but then becomes hungry again. Thus, a relatively small portion of our life is spent satisfied. So these observations, in my view, reveal a range of asymmetries in the magnitude, persistence, and nature of the goods and bads in life, suggesting the deck is well and truly stacked against us. The human condition may well be more accurately described as the human predicament. Now, let's move on and take a look at desire. In this section, I want to introduce an analogy which I think will help illustrate our predicament. When I was a child, some charities would use a specific form of equipment called a money spinner that would encourage people to make donations. You would insert a coin and watch as gravity pulled it towards a hole in the center. The curvature of the surface inside would cause the coin to spiral around the hole until eventually, absent some external force intervening, gravity would win and the coin would drop into the hole. I believe our condition as sentient beings suffers from a similar sort of center of gravity, one characterized by deprivation, dissatisfaction, and suffering. Let me explain. We naturally gravitate towards states of deprivation and discontent. No effort is required to encounter deprivation, dissatisfaction, or suffering. In contrast, achieving satisfaction, pleasure, or fortune almost always requires effort to be put into it. Likewise, desire and want often just naturally arise in us. We don't have to seek them out. And along with those feelings come a natural sense of frustration, discomfort, or longing. To illustrate this further, think of something as simple as hunger and thirst. These sensations arise in us effortlessly, but satisfying them requires effort, acquiring food or water, preparing it and assuring it's safe to consume. Similarly, ill health afflicts us without any effort on our part. Without taking the necessary precautions like exercise, eating well, and taking appropriate supplementation, we can easily fall ill. In fact, even if we do all those things, we can still fall ill. A sedentary lifestyle, literally making no effort, brings a host of associated ailments, reinforcing this need for the regular expenditure of effort. We have to regularly expend effort simply to maintain the baseline of health that doesn't even guarantee our well-being. Another example, loneliness and boredom come uninvited, and we must actively seek out entertainment or nurture relationships or train our minds to cope with solitude, an endeavor that itself can be quite challenging. And this reminds me of a quote by Arthur Schopenhauer, which was shown at the start of the video. If life, the craving for which is the very essence of our being, were possessed of any positive intrinsic value, there would be no such thing as boredom at all. Mere existence would satisfy us in itself, and we should want for nothing. What I'm getting at here is that we're constantly drawn towards our center of gravity, which is characterized by hunger, thirst, ill health, boredom, loneliness, and other ills, deprivation, and discontent. These naturally manifest in our lives unless we maintain consistent effort to fend them off, and even then, they will punctuate our existence. Moreover, many of these dynamics are persistent rather than having some endpoint. After achieving a level of satisfaction, say having a nice meal, we quickly begin to drift back to our center of gravity. Even with a more significant thing than having a meal, we can often suffer from the illusion that we can gain lasting satisfaction, but this is rarely the case. Again, as David Benatar notes in his Eon article, there is a treadmill and an escalator of desire. Fulfilled desires simply give rise to new ones. Schopenhauer actually painted a vivid image of this dynamic, likening it to a bird of prey hovering above us, ready to swoop down and introduce a new need or desire when we shed one. And this phenomena is echoed in Buddhist philosophy as well, with the concept of the hungry ghost. Pretas, or hungry ghosts, are beings who are tormented by desire that can never be satisfied. They're often portrayed with tiny mouths and throats and the swollen bellies of the starving, meaning they can never consume enough to ease the suffering of their hungers. And while some individuals do manage to somewhat escape this treadmill of desire through dedicated practice to things like meditation or mindfulness, it's important to recognize that this isn't a silver bullet. Even those who practice these methods still inhabit bodies capable of extreme suffering, and their ability to maintain such practices won't be permanent. And just generally, for most people, these practices don't serve as a viable solution. Now, to give a bit more context here, it's useful to understand the evolutionary context within which we all exist as sentient beings. We evolved through natural selection, optimizing for gene replication, not for individual satisfaction or happiness or contentment. In other words, we evolved to be motivated. Being generally satiated may lead to a reduction in motivation to carry out the tasks that someone needs to survive long enough to be able to reproduce. Without the dissatisfaction that characterizes our lives and motivates us to get to the point to reproduce, we'd likely be less able to get to reproductive age and then reproduce to pass on our genes. Dissatisfaction, suffering, and deprivation, and the promise of their opposites, are the carrot and stick that govern our lives, and our lives are permeated by much more of the stick than they are the carrot. To which some may ask, if our lives are so pervaded by dissatisfaction, then why do we and why did our ancestors want to reproduce? Now, besides the fact that reproduction can often be as a result of sex, another thing we're strongly motivated to want, or perhaps more self-centered reasons for motivating, there are a range of things that philosophical pessimists refer to as self-deception mechanisms that are operating in human psychology and could lead us to evaluate our lives as being better than actually they are. This is something we're going to cover in a later section. Anyway, I'm hoping that this evolutionary context kind of helps people to understand the pessimistic center of gravity that I've been describing. Our condition as sentient beings is a result of what was advantageous to our genes, not necessarily what was conducive to our individual happiness or satisfaction. One of the defining aspects of our lives is attachment. We form attachments to people, places, objects, ideas, identities, and many more things. These connections can provide us with a sense of belonging, well-being, and meaning. But attachment is a double-sided blade. Buddhism teaches us to recognize the impermanent nature of the world. Since everything is constantly changing, our attachments are inevitably tied to people, places, and things that will be altered or just cease to exist. We pursue attachment because of the pleasure it brings us, but this can also manifest as a form of addiction. The 8th century Buddhist teacher Shantideva illustrated this concept with the imagery of licking honey off a razor blade. In Awaken Every Day, 365 Buddhist reflections to invite mindfulness and joy, Thubten Chodron explains the analogy. Attachment is like honey on a razor blade. The honey tastes so sweet as we're licking it off the blade, but simultaneously we're hurting ourselves. This is the deceptive quality of clinging to the things of this life, thinking that they will bring us happiness. Generally, there is a pleasurable feeling in the mind when attachment is present. We're so addicted to this low-grade fleeting happiness that we opt for it without realizing its dangers. It is a setup for misery because it is fleeting and brings a new set of problems. Attachment to fleeting happiness of possession, status, and so forth blinds us to the fulfillment of awakening and the bliss of liberation, which are stable forms of joy and satisfaction. Instead, we keep licking the honey off the razor blade. It's not enough to remember the disadvantages of attachment intellectually. We need to examine our life and find many examples of how it deceives us and brings us suffering in the here and now. Consider love as an example. A loving relationship can be one of life's most intense pleasures, often cited as a key reason for living, but it can also be a profound source of pain. This deep attachment brings with it anxiety about the thoughts and feelings of the other person. What if the person meets someone else, dies, or just simply leaves? Am I enough? We can and usually do become dependent on the other person for validation, handing over the keys to at least some of our emotional regulation and psychological well-being to someone other than ourselves. And if the relationship were to sour and come to an end, or more, as all relationships do come to an end with death, this can be one of the greatest sources of suffering in life as well. And that's because of our attachment. The key point here is not to say that all relationships are like this all of the time, but to convey that attachment is a significant part of our lives. And whilst it can be positive, it's also the source of a lot of suffering, like honey on a razor blade. So far, I've spoken about how our lives tend to lean more towards ill-being than well-being. In the face of this, some optimists may still argue that on balance, our lives are still good. In this section, we're going to explore 3 theories on the quality of our lives, as discussed in David Benatar's book, Better Never to Have Been: The Harm of Coming into Existence, demonstrating how our lives often fall short on all 3. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover all 3 theories in exhaustive detail. You can do further reading by reading the book itself, but I can extract an overview from his own words. So, Benatar Benatar introduces these three theories. According to hedonistic theories, a life goes well or badly depending on the extent to which it's characterized by positive or negative mental states, pleasure and pain, broadly construed. According to desire fulfillment theories, the quality of a person's life is assessed in terms of the extent to which desires are fulfilled. What is desired might include mental states, but it can also include states of the external world. According to objectivist theories, the quality of a life is determined by the extent to which it is characterized by certain objective goods and bads. On objectivist theories, some things are good for us irrespective of whether they bring pleasure in any given situation and irrespective of whether we desire them. Other things are bad for us whether or not they bring pain and whether or not we desire them. So, starting with the hedonistic view, Benatar says this: we tend to ignore just how much our lives is characterized by negative mental states, even if often only relatively mildly negative ones. Consider, for example, conditions causing negative mental states daily or more often. These include hunger, thirst, bowel and bladder distension as these organs become filled, tiredness, stress, thermal discomfort, that is, feeling either too hot or too cold, and itch. For billions of people, at least some of these discomforts are chronic. These people cannot relieve their hunger, escape the cold, or avoid the stress. However, even those who can find some relief do not do so immediately or perfectly, and thus experience them to some extent every day. In fact, if we think about it, significant periods of each day are marked by some or other of these states. For example, unless one is eating and drinking so regularly as to prevent hunger and thirst or countering them as they arise, one is likely hungry and thirsty for a few hours a day. Unless one is lying about all day, one is probably tired for a substantial portion of one's waking life. How often does one feel neither too hot nor too cold, but exactly right? The negative mental states mentioned so far, however, are simply the baseline one's characteristic of healthy daily life. Chronic ailments and advancing age make matters worse. Aches, pains, lethargy, and sometimes frustration from disability become an experiential backdrop for everything else. Now add those discomforts, pains, and sufferings that are experienced either less frequently or only by some, though nonetheless very many, people. These include allergies, headaches, frustration, irritation, colds, menstrual pains, hot flushes, nausea, hypoglycemia, seizures, guilt, shame, boredom, sadness, depression, loneliness, body image dissatisfaction, the ravages of AIDS, of cancer, and of other such life-threatening diseases, and grief and bereavement. The reach of negative mental states in ordinary lives is extensive. Next, let's look at desire fulfillment theory. Benatar points out that everything we've just covered in the hedonistic theory also applies here, since many of the things we desire are actually positive mental states and the absence of negative ones. Given just how many negative mental states we have, the many desires for their absence are thwarted. We also desire pleasures, and some of those pleasures are satisfied. Rather little of our lives is characterized by satisfied desires, and rather a lot is marked by unsatisfied desires. Consider just how vulnerable our desires are to the vicissitudes of life. No desires for that which we lack are ever satisfied immediately. Such a desire must be present before it can be satisfied, and thus we endure a period of frustration before the desire is fulfilled. We usually persist in a state of desire for a period of time. This time may vary from minutes to decades. Children wait years to gain independence. Adolescents and adults can wait years to fulfill desires for personal satisfaction or professional success. One has a desire not to lose one's health and youth, but it happens all too quickly. The wrinkles appear, the hair grows grey or falls out, and the back aches, arthritis ravages one's joints, the eyes weaken, one becomes flabby and saggy. One wishes not to be bereaved, but unless one's desire not to die is thwarted sooner than later, one must soon face the death of grandparents, parents, and other dear ones. Often one's desires are never fulfilled. One yearns to be free, but dies incarcerated or oppressed. One seeks wisdom, but never attains it. One hankers after being beautiful, but is congenitally and irreversibly ugly. One aspires to great wealth and influence, but remains poor and impotent all one's life. Finally, let's consider objectivist theories. Benatar explains that what we've just discussed in the hedonistic and desire fulfillment theories are also relevant here, as positive mental states and fulfilled desires would be included in any objective list of goods. However, Benatar critiques the objectivist theory, noting that it is often constructed relative to the average human life, making it subjective to the human condition. He argues, knowing how well a particular life goes in comparison with other lives tells us very little about the baseline, how good human life is. If one's aim is to determine how good human life is, then the human perspective is manifestly an unreliable perspective from which to decide on what should be on the list of goods. From the human perspective, what we take to be worthwhile is very much determined by the limits of what we can expect. Benatar provides a list of potential objective goods that leave the human condition wanting. For instance, since none of us lives until age 240, people tend not to think that failing to reach that age makes one's life go less well. However, most people regard it as tragic when somebody dies at 40, at least if that person's quality of life was comparatively good. But why should a death at 90 not be tragic if a death at 40 is? The only answer can be that our judgment is constrained by our circumstances. A very plausible candidate for the list of objective goods is a life's having meaning. A meaningless life would be lacking an important good, even if it had other goods. Many people do think, even if only occasionally, that all lives lack meaning. They look at life subspecies aeternitatis and see no point to it. Most people, however, find the idea of life's meaninglessness intolerable and suggest that our lives are meaningful. Many, but not all, of these resort to a different perspective, that of humanity or that of an individual person, from which at least some lives can be meaningful. Some argue that it does not matter that our lives are meaningless from the perspective of the universe. Even if that were true, it would surely be better if our lives had meaning independently of our own human perspective, if they mattered from perspective of the universe. Thus, at the very least, we should see our lives as much less good for not mattering from that perspective. Other examples of objective goods could be good health, possessing great knowledge and wisdom, and contributing significantly to humanity. Yet even the best of human lives are often marred by ill health. Even the wisest amongst us lack much of the knowledge available to us, to say nothing of the knowledge that isn't available to us, and few achieve lasting significance, with those that do often having complicated legacies. In summary, on all three accounts of the quality of human life, we fall short. Engaging with the philosophical pessimist assessment of life, I think, offers a more realistic perspective. And this exploration of our predicament isn't intended to make people feel worse about their lives or to encourage people to wallow in despair. In an interview on the Unsiloed podcast, David Benatar expresses the same sentiment.
So let's imagine somebody's more chipper than they should be, as it were, given their objective condition. I say should be in the sense that they're not tracking reality. Well, I don't think we should go and burst everybody's balloon. I don't think we should go and say you should be a lot more miserable and I'm going to make you a lot more miserable, because there's something sort of cruel and unkind about that. And I want to say that people should be allowed a certain level of distraction and sometimes even delusion.
In fact, beyond being of intellectual interest to some, this critical analysis of the sentient and human condition is probably not that relevant to our everyday lives. As David Hume points out in A Treatise of Human Nature, we can philosophize about our unfortunate predicament, but when it comes to living our everyday lives, these pessimistic concerns can and probably should fade into the background. Most fortunately, it happens that since reason is incapable of dispelling these clouds, nature herself suffices to that purpose and cures me of this philosophical melancholy and delirium, either by relaxing this bent of mind or by some evocation and lively impression of my senses which obliterate all these chimeras. I dine, I play a game of backgammon, I converse, and am merry with my friends. And when after 3 or 4 hours amusement I would return to these speculations, they appear so cold and strained and ridiculous that I cannot find in my heart to enter into them any farther. Here then I find myself absolutely and necessarily determined to live and talk and act like other people in the common affairs of life. Of course, this is easier said than done for many, but I include this to clarify that adopting such a pessimistic evaluation of the human condition does not conflict with one living a life that they deem worth continuing. But let's connect this to antinatalism. A misguided optimism about the quality of one's life can be dangerous. It might lead us to knowingly or unknowingly impose harm on others. Again, in his Unsiloed interview, Benatar says this.
I'm also a little concerned when people are so optimistic about the quality of life that they'll bring more children into the world. Maybe that's a case where your optimism is going too far and you're now inflicting hardship on others through your optimism.
Our self-deception, which I'll touch on a bit more later, can lead us to harm others through creating them. Remember, when we're creating someone, we're putting them into a world rife with asymmetries, where the bad seem to be generally of a much worse nature than the goods are good. Their condition as a sentient being is predisposed to ill-being, which I referred earlier to as their center of gravity. They'll form attachments, some become extremely intimate and strong, that will in time degrade and be broken, if by nothing else but death. And someone who, on all three accounts of the quality of life that we've discussed, will have a life left wanting. These seem to be extraordinarily bad conditions to bring a being capable of being harmed into. Failing to recognize these characteristics of our lives could hinder us in understanding the very real harm we're subjecting them to when we create them. Now, of course, some people watching this video will be naturally sympathetic to what I'm saying, but others won't be. So for those that remain unconvinced, I'm now going to cover some objections. So, some of you may have some reservations about what I've said so far. So let's dive into some common objections. Objection 1. Who are you to tell anyone how good or bad their life is? Our subjective evaluation of our life is the only thing that matters. Surely the lived experience of an individual is the most valid measure of whether their life has actually been good or not. After all, someone may find themselves in materially poor conditions, yet still judge their life to be fulfilling, simply because their subjective experience is positive. Who are we to say that they're mistaken in their assessment? Now, whilst I don't fully support this criticism, I do have some sympathies with it. However, I don't think that it does the work that the proponents of it hope it's going to do. In Oscar Wilde's Lady Windermere's Fan, Lord Darlington poetically observes that we are all in the gutter, yet some of us are looking up at the stars. And I want to give this analogy a bit of a pessimistic twist. I believe we are all in the gutter. Our lives are accurately characterized by the pessimistic evaluations that I've laid out. But many people are gazing up at stars that are either distracting them from our predicament or misleading them to think that this predicament simply doesn't exist, or maybe both. And this is where doubt may be introduced into the validity of self-assessments of the quality of life. There seem to be two main forms of self-deception that are of interest here. One are a set of cognitive biases that seem to distort our understanding and experiences of our predicament. The second are a range of distractions which divert our attention away from our predicament. In his essay The Last Messiah, Peter Wessel-Zapf discusses the cognitive burden we as humans carry with minds hungry for meaning and purpose in an indifferent and an absurd world that leaves that hunger unfulfilled. This condition leads to what Zapf calls existential despair. To cope, he says that our minds have developed mechanisms to suppress this discomfort. He identifies four main types of suppression mechanism: isolation, attachment, distraction, and sublimation. Attachment, or anchoring as some people call it, is the process by which we cling or form some form of belonging to a people, place, community, idea, object, or anything else. We join religions, causes, and communities, embark on journeys and undertake challenges, all to provide us with some narrative or context within which to situate ourselves, even if this is something as ordinary as a football team. These attachments help us to ground our psychological well-being in what Zapf calls a stable sphere, which provides a level of stability in a chaotic and ever-changing world. Next is distraction. Zapf describes distraction as essentially us indulging in activities that divert our attention away from confronting our existential predicament. This could be as simple as playing games, gossiping, or engaging in sports. Zapf likens this distraction to an airplane. It may be compared to an airplane made out of heavy metal, but with an inbuilt principle which, as long as it is fully functioning, keeps it in the air. Since the air will hold it for no more than a second, it needs to be constantly moving. Routine may cause the pilot to become drowsy and inattentive, but as soon as the engine fails, the situation becomes critical. And Blaise Pascal echoes this sentiment in Pensée. And those who philosophize on the matter and who think men unreasonable for spending a whole day in chasing a hare which they would not have bought scarce know our nature. The hare in itself would not screen us from the sight of death and calamities, but the chase which turns away our attention from these does screen us. And this actually reminds me of an observation often put forward in the context of Buddhist practice, in that most of us would find it hard to remain psychologically in the present moment for even a brief period of time, say for 1 minute. I mean, even if we were offered £1 million to keep our attention on the present moment for just 1 minute, very few of us could do this. Our minds seem to be predisposed to being caught up in a constant stream of thought, which could be seen, as Zapp refers to, as distraction. Then we come to isolation. This refers to the arbitrary expulsion of any disturbing or destructive thoughts and feelings from one's consciousness. An example being that death is often hidden from our daily lives. Even when confronted with death, it's typically within a context that distracts us or separates the existential concerns that can come associated with death. Perhaps this is a crude example, but there are some cultures that literally dress up their dead and even treat the deceased with chemicals to look as if they were only sleeping. And finally, there's sublimation. This is the channeling of existential angst into creative or productive endeavors like art, philosophy, or other forms of expression. Individuals transfer their inner turmoil into something meaningful, viewing the darker aspects of life from what Zapp refers to as a detached aesthetic point of view. He even uses his own essay as an example of sublimation. This current essay, in fact, is a classic attempt at sublimation. The author is not suffering, rather he is filling in sheets of paper which are to be published. He's discussing the darker aspects of life, but he's intellectualizing and abstracting them so as to observe them from this detached aesthetic point of view. The key takeaway here is not whether you resonate with these specific examples of suppression mechanisms, but rather that we do intentionally or otherwise indulge in suppressing our reflection on the less appealing aspects of our existence. Much like how the suspension of a car buffers the rough surface of a road, these mechanisms help to mitigate the harsher sides of life. There are also a range of cognitive biases that influence our judgment on how good or bad our lives have gone. Again, in his book Better Never to Have Been, and also in his book The Human Predicament, David Benatar discusses this. In The Human Predicament, he says, people's self-assessments of well-being are unreliable indicators of quality of life because these self-assessments are influenced by three psychological phenomena, the existence of which has been well demonstrated. The three features of our psychology that Benatar identifies here are Pollyannism, adaptation, and comparison. Firstly, the Pollyanna principle, which is the tendency to evaluate things to be more positive than they actually are. Benatar explains how this manifests in our lives in various ways. First, there is an inclination to recall positive rather than negative experiences. For example, when asked to recall events from throughout their lives, subjects in a number of studies listed a much greater number of positive than negative experiences. This selective recall distorts our judgment of how well our lives have gone so far. It is not only assessments of our past that are biased, but also our projections or expectations about the future. We tend to have an exaggerated view of how good things will be. The Pollyannism, typical of recall and projection, is also characteristic of subjective assessments about current and overall well-being. Many studies have consistently shown that self-assessments of well-being are markedly skewed towards the positive end of the spectrum. Indeed, most people believe that they are better off than most others or than the average person. The second phenomena at play here is comparison. If one's self-assessment were reliable, they would track improvements and deteriorations in one's objective conditions. That is to say, if one's condition improved or deteriorated, one would perceive one's condition to have improved or deteriorated to that degree. Self-assessment would then remain fixed until there was a further improvement or deterioration, in response to which one's self-assessment would also adjust. However, that is not what happens. Our subjective assessments do respond to shifts in our objective conditions, but the altered self-assessment is not stable. As we adjust to our new condition, we cease to rate our condition as we did when we first improved or deteriorated. For example, if one suddenly loses the use of both legs, one's subjective assessment will drop precipitously. In time, however, subjective assessments of quality of life will improve as one adjusts to the paralysis. One's objective condition will not have improved, the paralysis remains, but one will judge life to be going less badly than immediately after the paralysis. And then finally, there's comparison. Subjective assessments of well-being implicitly involve comparison with the well-being of others. Our judgments about the quality of our lives are influenced by the perceived quality of the lives of others. One consequence of this is that bad features of all human lives are substantially overlooked in judging the quality of one's life. Because these features of one's life are no worse than those of other humans, we tend to omit them in reaching a judgment about the quality of our life. Now, critics may argue that adaptation and comparison may actually also lead us to underestimate the quality of our lives, rather than to overestimate it. Benatar says this in response: of these three psychological phenomena, it is only only Pollyannism that inclines people unequivocally towards more positive assessments of how well their life is going. We adapt not only to negative situations, but also to positive ones, and we compare ourselves not only with those who are worse off, but also with those who are better off than we are. However, given the force of Pollyannism, both adaptation and comparison operate both from an optimistic baseline and under the influence of optimistic biases. All of these mechanisms of self-deception prevent us from fully acknowledging and engaging with the predicament of our existence. I think it's important for us to be aware of these self-deception mechanisms and any others that are present in our psychology that lead us to make overly optimistic evaluations of our lives. In the context of antinatalism, these strategies likely evolved to increase the likelihood of our reproduction. Thomas Metzinger, in his essay Suffering, makes some interesting speculations about how these mechanisms could have evolved to enhance our likelihood of procreation. If, on the finest introspective level of phenomenological granularity that is functionally available to it, a self-conscious system would discover too many negatively valenced moments, then this discovery might paralyze it and prevent it from procreating. The logic of psychological evolution mandates the concealment of the fact from the self-modeling system caught on the hedonic treadmill. It would be an advantage if insights into the deep structure of its own mind, insights of the type just sketched, were not reflected in its conscious self-model too strongly. And if it suffered from a robust version of optimism bias, perhaps it is exactly the main function of the human self-model's higher levels to drive the organism continuously forward, to generate a functionally adequate form of self-deception, glossing over everyday life's ugly details by developing a grandiose and unrealistic, optimistic inner story, a narrative self-model with which we can identify. In simpler terms, what Metzinger is basically saying is that if we fully understood the true quality and prospects of our lives, we might be less inclined to procreate. And so those individuals equipped with these self-deception mechanisms that hinder a more sober reflection on our predicament would probably be more likely to reproduce and then pass on their genes. We need to be aware that we and our psychology along with us have evolved to increase the likelihood of our reproduction and passing on our genes, not for genuine happiness and fulfillment and accurately understanding the quality of our lives. And finally, imagine if we did solely rely on someone's subjective assessment about the quality of their life. This could lead us to accept pretty strange conclusions. For instance, if someone endured horrific child abuse, but then in later life, for whatever reason, assessed their childhood to be actually exceptionally good, are we expected to just accept this uncritically? Surely people can be mistaken to at least some degree about the quality of their life. Objection 2. Most people are happy to be born and want to continue their lives. Doesn't this show our lives aren't so bad and it's okay to have kids? Again, in responding to this objection, I would refer to the self-deception mechanisms we've just gone over. But in addition to that, I'd like to examine this idea that is implicit in this objection of retrospective consent. So implicit in this idea that most people are happy to have been born, which we can just accept for the sake of argument, is this idea that it's okay to create more people because they will retrospectively consent to having been born. I see this line of reasoning as quite worrying. Justifying an action on the basis of retrospective consent could lead us to sign off on pretty egregious things. Heta Hyrie illustrates this in her book, The Limits of Medical Paternalism. But there is one difficulty with the doctrine of future consent, which is serious enough to refute it altogether. This is the possibility of manipulating the recipient of the paternalistic intervention in a manner that automatically leads to consent and gratitude later. Given a simple interpretation of the doctrine, it would be permissible for the public authorities to imprison people and turn them into religious or political fanatics, provided only that the manipulative program in question includes a section which teaches the brainwashed people themselves to appreciate the treatment when it is over. Whether mistaken or not in their assessment, assessing ourselves to have good lives does not justify imposing harm on someone else by creating them. The goods we appeal to as reasons for continuing our lives cannot be appealed to as reasons for starting someone else's life. Unlike our circumstances where we exist and have pre-existing desires and wants, there is no one who exists before we create them to want or need the things that we enjoy as people who already exist. Objection 3. We gain a lot from the suffering and hardship we experience. It brings meaning, purpose, and builds character. So there can be instrumental value in suffering and hardship, but there are a few points to make about this here. First of all, this doesn't mean that suffering itself is good. It just means we can gain instrumental value from it. Secondly, much of the suffering in the world is just purely gratuitous gratuitous. Cluster headaches provide no value to someone's life, but add severe suffering. Slowly dying of cancer that generates immense agony is not adding value to someone's life. There are many other examples like this. And we've got to remember that not all humans are capable of extracting instrumental value from suffering, as it often requires a certain level of cognitive capacity. And finally, while suffering can have instrumental value to us, that which is valuable to us who already exist is not of value to someone who doesn't exist, i.e. someone we're considering creating. And so we can't appeal to it as a reason counting in favor of creating them. For example, for us people who exist, it makes sense for us to go to the gym and elect to take on voluntary suffering for the greater gains in the future, but it doesn't make sense to create someone and then say, I created them so they could go to the gym and benefit from the gains, because they never needed those gains before you created them. And the final objection, 4. We should judge human lives by human standards, and compared to human standards, our lives can be very good. Of course, if we're to compare our lives to each other, then some of our lives will go relatively well and some of them will go relatively poorly. And this is an intuitive way of judging the quality of our lives. But as I've already noted on earlier in the video, this isn't reliable. Remember, one of the psychological phenomena that Benatar detailed, which makes our self-assessments unreliable, was comparison. In that if we compare our lives with others, we often miss in our evaluations the negative things in our lives that we have in common. As Benatar said, people are so used to the discomforts of daily life that they overlook them entirely, even though they are so pervasive. But just because some of our lives would be relatively good and some would be relatively bad, doesn't mean we should accept this approach to assessing the quality of our lives. We can zoom out and assess our lives just on their merits. For instance, imagine there was another species of human that looked as we do and generally functioned as we do, but they universally suffered from extreme depression and had very little respite from it. There would still be some variation in the quality of their lives, with some going relatively well and some going relatively badly, but would we really take that approach as being a reasonable one in judging the actual quality of their lives? It seems clear that all of their lives would be very bad, even though some of them are relatively good. As such, I think it's okay to judge regular human lives like yours and mine on their merits and not relative to each other. Each of us has been put in this predicament by others. We exist within a complex web of interactions, relationships, and incentives that were not of our choosing. Whilst we can adapt to our situation and strive to make the best of it, many of the good things in our lives come at the cost of preceding suffering or deprivation. We must endure unpleasantness that we would prefer to avoid in order to gain the things or experiences we value. These trade-offs are what we must navigate and accept in a reality that we never consented to. It's imperative that we consider these circumstances when thinking about whether we want to create another person or not. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, whether you agreed or disagreed, and I'll see you in the next one.